Let's begin today's lecture by breaking down what we mean when we talk about the sociological perspective. Sociology is the systematic study of human society, but more than just collecting facts or statistics, it's about understanding how society works and how it influences people's lives. This perspective encourages us to step outside our personal viewpoints and look at the bigger picture of how society shapes individual behavior. The first key idea here is what we call seeing the general in the particular. That means recognizing that even though each person is unique, the things we do often follow broader patterns. Sociologists look at how the behaviors of individuals are connected to larger social trends. For example, think about something like going to college. It might feel like a personal decision, but patterns show that people from higher income families are more likely to attend college than those from lower income families. That's not just coincidence. It points to a general social pattern. This leads us to the idea that society doesn't treat everyone the same way. It acts differently on people depending on what social categories they belong to, things like age, gender, race, class, religion, and more. These categories help shape our experiences and the opportunities available to us. So two people might grow up in the same city but live very different lives because they belong to different social groups. This is what we mean when we say general categories shape particular experiences. The second idea in this perspective is seeing the strange in the familiar. This might sound a little abstract, but it's actually pretty straightforward. It means taking a step back and questioning the things we usually take for granted. Think about everyday routines, traditions, or values that just seem normal. From a sociological point of view, we don't just accept them. We ask why they exist, where they came from, and how they shape us. For instance, why do we shake hands when we meet someone? Or why is it common in some societies to move out of your parents' home as soon as you turn 18? While in others, people live with extended family well into adulthood. These everyday things might seem totally natural, but sociology encourages us to look at them as social constructs, practices shaped by cultural values, history, and social expectations. Finally, this perspective challenges the idea that people simply choose their behaviors in a vacuum. It doesn't mean we have no agency or free will, but it reminds us that our choices are heavily influenced by the social context we're in. Things like family, education, religion, media, and laws all play a role in shaping how we think and act. So rather than seeing behavior as purely individual, sociology helps us understand how deeply it's connected to the society around us. So in short, the sociological perspective asks us to zoom out, to see how individual lives are shaped by the social structures we're all part of, whether we realize it or not. Now let's take this perspective a bit further and look at how it helps us understand something very personal, something that most people would assume is entirely individual, the decision to take one's own life. It might seem like suicide is purely a private act driven by personal emotions or mental health issues. But one of the foundational insights in sociology is that even deeply personal decisions can be shaped by social forces. A classic study looked at suicide rates and found clear patterns that suggest it's not just about individual feelings. Society plays a role too. For example, the research showed that certain groups were consistently more likely to die by suicide than others. Men were more likely than women, Protestants more than Catholics or Jewish people, the wealthy more than the poor, the unmarried more than those who are married. What this tells us is that there's something about these social categories, something about the kind of social support, connection, or expectation people experience in these groups that influences this outcome. People who are more socially isolated or less integrated into a strong community structure tend to be at higher risk. So it's not just about what's happening inside a person's mind, it's also about what's happening around them in their social world. And what's really interesting is that even though this research is over 100 years old, the basic patterns still hold true today. If we look at current statistics, we see that men are still nearly 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. That's not just biology at work. That's a clue that gender roles, expectations, and social connections matter. So this example is a powerful reminder of what sociology helps us do. It helps us see individuality in context. It shows us that even the most personal experiences are shaped by where we fit in the broader social structure. Another way to think about the sociological perspective is by looking at how it becomes especially clear in certain situations, like when people feel like outsiders, or when society is going through rapid change. For some groups of people, feeling like an outsider isn't just occasional, it's part of everyday life. If you don't fit into the dominant or majority category in a society because of your race, religion, gender identity, social class, or any number of other things, you're often more aware of how society is structured. That outsider status can make social rules and expectations more visible simply because they're not working in your favor. When you're part of the dominant group, it's easier to overlook the impact of social forces. You might just think things are normal. But when you're outside that dominant category, you're more likely to notice how norms, institutions, and unspoken rules shape your experiences differently. In that way, being an outsider can actually sharpen your sociological awareness. We also see this awareness grow during times of rapid change or crisis. When society is stable, we tend to take things for granted. But when there's a big disruption, like an economic recession, a political shift, or a public health crisis, suddenly people start asking deeper questions. They feel off balance, like the ground is shifting under them. And that's often when they begin to see the social patterns that were always there, just hidden in plain sight. So whether it's through personal experience or broader social upheaval, these moments give us the chance to see sociologically, to recognize the connections between individual lives and larger social forces. A key part of thinking sociologically is using a global perspective. This means looking beyond our own communities or country to understand how we're connected to the rest of the world and how those connections shape our everyday lives. Where we live has a huge impact on our opportunities, challenges, and even how we see the world. Growing up in Canada, for example, gives us access to certain resources, freedoms, and standards of living that aren't available everywhere. But we can't fully understand those advantages unless we compare them to what life is like in other parts of the world. And today, those global connections are stronger than ever. Through technology, trade, migration, and media, societies are tied together in complex ways. What happens in one part of the world, whether it's a financial crisis, a war, or a supply chain issue, can have ripple effects that reach us here in Canada. We also need to recognize that many of the issues we face, like poverty, inequality, or climate change, exist on a global scale. In some places, these problems are much more severe. So thinking globally helps put our own challenges into perspective. It reminds us that while we may see something as a serious problem, others may be experiencing it in much more extreme forms. And finally, looking at the world through this broader lens actually helps us understand ourselves better. By comparing cultures, values, and ways of life, we get a clearer sense of what's unique about our own society and what we might take for granted. A global perspective gives us context, and with that context, we become more informed, more empathetic, and more thoughtful in how we see our place in the world. To understand where sociology comes from, we need to look at the social changes that helped shape it as a discipline. Sociology didn't just appear out of nowhere. It developed in response to major transformations happening in society. One big change was industrialization. As societies shifted from farming to factory work, people moved from rural areas into cities. This urban growth created a lot of new challenges: overcrowding, poverty, pollution, and unfamiliar ways of living. The traditional ways of organizing life no longer seemed to work in these fast-changing environments. At the same time, people were also beginning to think differently about politics and individual rights. New ideas about democracy, freedom, and equality started to gain ground, and that raised important questions about how society should be organized and who should have power. All of this led to a new kind of awareness. People began to step back and look at society as something that could be studied and understood, not just accepted as it was. That's where science enters the picture. There was a growing belief that society could be examined using the same principles used to study the natural world. This approach is what we call positivism. It's the idea that we can understand society through observation, evidence, and scientific reasoning, rather than just through tradition, religion, or speculation. This shift in thinking also followed a broader pattern, sometimes described in stages. First came the theological stage, where people explained the world through religion and the will of the gods. Then the metaphysical stage, where society was seen more abstractly, still spiritual, but guided by philosophical ideas about nature or human destiny. Finally, the scientific stage emerged, where observation and evidence became the main tools for understanding how society works. This move toward a scientific approach laid the groundwork for sociology as a formal discipline, one that doesn't just describe society, but asks how and why it changes, and what those changes mean for the people living through them. So, why does any of this matter? What are the actual benefits of thinking sociologically? Well, there are several, and they all have real-life implications. First, the sociological perspective helps us assess the truth of common sense. We hear a lot of statements like hard work always leads to success, or people get what they deserve. These kinds of beliefs are taken for granted in everyday life. But sociology encourages us to question them. It asks, is that really true for everyone? When we dig into the data and look at social patterns, we often find that these ideas don't hold up across the board. This perspective helps us separate fact from assumption. Second, it helps us see the opportunities and constraints in our lives. It's easy to think that we are fully in control of our own destinies. And while personal effort does matter, sociology shows us that our choices are often shaped or even limited by larger social forces. Things like gender, race, income, and education levels can open some doors while closing others. When we understand these dynamics, we get a clearer picture of what's really influencing our life paths. Third, the sociological perspective can empower us to be more active participants in society. Once we recognize how social structures work, we can start to question them and even work to change them. Whether it's advocating for more inclusive policies, supporting social movements, or just being more thoughtful in our everyday decisions, this perspective gives us tools to engage more meaningfully with the world around us. Fourth, it helps us live in a diverse world. Canada, and the world in general, is made up of many different cultures, backgrounds, and ways of life. Understanding sociology helps us navigate that diversity with more empathy and awareness. It reminds us that people's experiences are shaped by many different social factors, and that there's value in trying to understand those differences rather than judging them. And finally, this perspective can also shape your career. Sociologists work in many different roles as researchers for government agencies, private foundations, or businesses. They collect and analyze data to understand social trends and help make informed decisions. But beyond formal jobs, the skills you develop through sociology, critical thinking, data analysis, understanding social systems, are useful in a wide range of fields, from education and public health to marketing and urban planning. So whether you're thinking about your own life, your role in society, or your future career, the sociological perspective gives you a powerful set of tools to work with. Now let's talk about sociological theory, which is all about making sense of what we observe in society. At its core, a theory is just a way of explaining how and why certain facts are connected. It helps us move beyond just describing what we see to understanding the bigger picture of how society works. In sociology, we use something called a theoretical approach to guide our thinking. This is basically a framework, a basic image or model of society that shapes how we ask questions, what we look for in our research, and how we interpret what we find. There are three main approaches that sociologists tend to use, and each one looks at society in a different way. The first is the structural functional approach. This view sees society as a complex system with many parts, and each part has a function that helps keep the system stable and running smoothly. Think of society like a machine or an organism. Every institution, from family and education to religion and the economy, works together to maintain social order. When something isn't working right, like a high unemployment rate or rising crime, this approach looks at how that disrupts the system and what changes might restore balance. Next, we have the social conflict approach. This perspective sees society not as a smoothly functioning system, but as an arena of inequality and competition. It focuses on power struggles between groups, especially around things like class, race, gender, and other forms of inequality. According to this view, social structures don't always benefit everyone equally. Instead, some groups are privileged while others are marginalized. So this approach asks, who benefits, who's being left out, and how do those inequalities shape people's lives? Finally, there's the symbolic interaction approach. This one zooms in to look at the everyday interactions between individuals. It's less about big institutions and more about how people create and interpret meaning in their social lives. Through things like language, gestures, and shared symbols, we build our understanding of the world and of each other. This perspective helps us see how our identities and relationships are shaped in small but powerful ways through daily social interaction. Each of these approaches offers a different lens. They don't cancel each other out. In fact, they often work best when used together to get a more complete picture of how society operates. Let's take a closer look at the structural functional approach, one of the main ways sociologists analyze society. This perspective views society as a complex system made up of different parts that all work together to maintain stability and solidarity. The basic idea here is that just like parts of a machine or organs in a body, different elements of society serve specific purposes that help the whole system run smoothly. A key concept in this approach is social structure. This refers to any relatively stable pattern of social behavior, things like family, education, religion, or the legal system. These structures don't just appear out of nowhere. They're shaped over time by a framework for how people interact and organize their lives. Along with structure, we also talk about social function, which means the consequences or effects a particular social pattern has for the operation of society as a whole. In other words, what role does it play in keeping society going? Now, functions can be broken down into a few different types. First, there are manifest functions. These are the intended and obvious outcomes of a social pattern. Take schools, for example. A manifest function of education is to teach students skills and knowledge, but there are also latent functions, which are the unintended and often unrecognized outcomes. For instance, school also serves as a place where young people form social networks or learn discipline, things that aren't always part of the formal curriculum, but still play an important role. Then there's dysfunction, which refers to any social pattern that disrupts the operation of society. Not everything contributes to stability. Some patterns can create problems or inequalities that throw the system off balance. For example, while the criminal justice system is meant to maintain order, if it disproportionately targets certain groups, it can actually create more division and instability. So the structural functional approach helps us understand not just how society is organized, but also why certain structures exist, how they function, and what happens when things don't work as intended. Now let's move to the social conflict approach, which offers a very different view of society. Instead of seeing society as a stable system working together harmoniously, this perspective sees society as an arena of inequality, one where different groups compete for resources, power, and control. According to this approach, society is structured in a way that benefits some people at the expense of others. In other words, not everyone has equal access to opportunities, and the rules of the system often favor certain groups while disadvantaging others. The structures that exist, things like the economy, education, and the legal system, tend to support the interests of those who already hold power, often while reinforcing the struggles of those who don't. This perspective draws attention to how inequality operates along many different lines, not just wealth or class, but also race, ethnicity, gender, age, and sexual orientation. These factors aren't just personal identities, they're also tied to patterns of privilege and disadvantage in society. For example, think about access to high-paying jobs, quality education, or political influence. The social conflict approach would ask, who has access to these things and who doesn't, and why? It also focuses on how those in power often work to maintain their position, sometimes at the expense of others. But this approach doesn't just point out problems, it also emphasizes change. Conflict between groups is seen as a driving force behind social transformation. When people recognize inequality, they may push back through protests, advocacy, or policy changes, and that's how progress often happens. So while the structural functional approach focuses on stability, the social conflict approach is more concerned with inequality, power struggles, and the forces that drive change in society. Now let's look more specifically at gender conflict theory, which is a branch of the broader social conflict approach. This perspective focuses on the inequality and tension that exists between women and men in society. It looks at how gender is not just a personal identity, but also a major organizing factor in how power and resources are distributed. Gender conflict theory highlights how many of society's structures and institutions have historically been shaped by and continue to support patriarchy, which is the dominance of men over women. This perspective also addresses sexism, or the belief that one sex is naturally superior to the other. Both of these ideas contribute to systems that disadvantage women and limit opportunities based on gender. This approach is closely tied to feminism, which is the movement for social equality between men and women. In sociology, feminist theory pushes us to examine how gender roles are created, maintained, and challenged, and how these roles affect everything from family life and education to politics and work. Using feminist theory in sociology also encourages us to recognize the contributions of women to the field itself. For a long time, women's voices were left out of mainstream sociological thinking. This approach helps correct that by showing how women, like Harriet Martineau, for example, played an important role in shaping early sociological thought, even if they weren't always given the recognition they deserved. Overall, gender conflict theory doesn't just point out gender-based inequality, it also pushes us to question the norms and values that keep those inequalities in place, and to consider what a more equal society might look like. Next, we turn to critical race theory, another important perspective in sociology that focuses on the relationship between race and broader systems of power. This approach looks closely at how race intersects with other factors, like class, gender, and citizenship status, to shape the everyday experiences of racialized groups. Critical race theory doesn't treat race as a simple, isolated category. Instead, it shows how race interacts with other social identities to produce complex layers of advantage and disadvantage. So, for example, the experience of a Black woman in Canada might be shaped not only by race, but also by gender, income level, and more. This approach helps us understand how multiple forms of inequality can overlap and reinforce each other. At its core, critical race theory argues that racism is not just a matter of individual prejudice. It's embedded in laws, policies, institutions, and cultural norms. It challenges the idea that we live in a post-racial society, and instead looks at how systemic racism continues to shape outcomes in areas like education, policing, housing, and employment. This perspective also works to highlight the contributions of racialized thinkers and communities to the development of sociology itself. Too often, these voices were ignored or excluded from mainstream academic work. Critical race theory helps correct that by recognizing the foundational work done by scholars from marginalized groups, people like Cecil Foster, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Daniel G. Hill, who brought crucial insight into the realities of racial inequality and justice. In short, critical race theory gives us tools to better understand how race and racism operate at all levels of society. And it pushes sociology to be more inclusive and aware of the diverse experiences and voices that shape our social world. Now let's shift gears and talk about the symbolic interaction approach, which offers a very different way of looking at society. While the structural, functional, and social conflict approaches are considered macro-level theories, meaning they look at society as a whole, symbolic interaction is a micro-level approach. It zooms in to focus on the small, everyday interactions between individuals. This perspective sees society not as a massive structure imposed on us from above, but as something we constantly build and shape through our interactions. According to this view, society exists because people come together and create shared meanings. It's all about how we interpret and respond to the world around us. For example, think about something as simple as a handshake. On the surface, it's just a small gesture, but in different situations, it can mean greeting, agreement, respect, or even a goodbye. Those meanings aren't built into the gesture itself. They're created through shared understanding. And that's what symbolic interactionism is interested in. This approach helps us understand how social reality is constructed through language, symbols, and everyday behavior. It's especially useful when looking at how people form identities, manage relationships, or navigate social roles. So while macro-level theories give us the big picture, symbolic interaction reminds us that society is also built moment by moment in conversations, habits, and small interactions that we might not even think about. It's those everyday exchanges that, when added up, shape the social world we live in. At this point, it's important to take a step back and critically assess the three main theoretical approaches we've discussed. Each one gives us a different lens through which to view society, but no single approach captures everything. Each has its strengths and also some important limitations. Let's start with the structural functional approach. While it's useful for understanding how society maintains order and stability, it often overlooks deep inequalities. It tends to assume that if something exists, it must be serving some function, even if that function benefits only a few people. So this approach tends to ignore issues of social class, race, and gender, and it downplays the importance of conflict and change. In focusing so much on stability, it can miss the voices and struggles of those who are disadvantaged by the system. Next, we have the social conflict approach. This perspective is great for highlighting inequality and pushing us to think critically about who benefits and who doesn't. But its weakness is that it can sometimes overlook the things that actually hold society together, like shared values, cooperation, and social bonds. Also, because this approach is often connected to calls for social change, critics argue that it can lose its objectivity and become more political than scientific. That's a fair debate, especially in research that's meant to influence policy or activism. And finally, the symbolic interaction approach. This one helps us understand how individuals create meaning in their everyday lives. But in focusing so closely on micro-level interactions, it can miss the bigger picture. It tends to overlook how larger structures like the economy, the education system, or systemic racism influence those day-to-day experiences. So while it's great for understanding individual behavior, it needs to be balanced with an awareness of broader social forces. So the key takeaway here is that no approach is perfect. They each offer valuable insights, but they also have blind spots. That's why sociologists often use multiple perspectives together to build a fuller, more balanced understanding of how society works. Now that we've looked at the major theoretical perspectives, let's turn to how sociologists actually do sociology, how they conduct research and interpret the world. There are three main approaches to doing sociology, and each one has a different focus and purpose. The first is positivist sociology. This approach is all about studying society using the tools of science. It's based on the idea that we can discover facts about human behavior through direct, systematic observation, just like we do in the natural sciences. Sociologists who use this method aim to be objective and to identify patterns that can be measured and analyzed. They use logic, data collection, and statistical analysis to uncover relationships between different parts of society. So if someone is studying how income affects educational outcomes, for example, they might collect survey data and look for measurable trends. Next, we have interpretive sociology, which takes a very different approach. Instead of focusing on objective facts, this method looks at the meanings people attach to their experiences. The key idea here is that society isn't just something out there to be measured. It's something people create through their interactions. This approach is guided by the principle of Verstehen, a German word that means understanding. It's about seeing the world from the point of view of the people being studied. So a researcher might interview individuals to understand how they make sense of a major life change or how they experience their cultural identity. Finally, there's critical sociology, which focuses on identifying problems and promoting social change. This approach doesn't just aim to understand society, it actively questions power structures and seeks to expose inequality and injustice. It takes an activist stance, often aligning with movements for social justice. The idea here is that research should not just describe the world, but help improve it. So a critical sociologist might study racism, poverty, or gender discrimination, not just to explain why these issues exist, but to support efforts to change them. Each of these approaches offers a different way of seeing and studying society. Some are more scientific and data-driven, while others focus on meaning or social justice. And again, just like with the theoretical perspectives, many sociologists draw from more than one of these approaches to get a fuller understanding of the social world. Let's take a deeper look at positivist sociology, which is the approach most closely linked to the scientific method. This way of doing sociology is based on the idea that we can study human behavior the same way we study the natural world, by using careful observation and logical reasoning to uncover patterns and relationships. In this approach, science is understood as a logical system that builds knowledge through direct and systematic observation. It's about looking at the world, collecting data in a structured way, and drawing conclusions based on what we can see, measure, or test. One of the key features of positivist sociology is that it relies on empirical evidence. That means information we can verify using our senses. So rather than relying on opinions, beliefs, or speculation, this method focuses on facts we can observe directly. This might include survey responses, crime rates, income levels, or any other data that can be counted or recorded. To organize all this information, sociologists use concepts. A concept is basically a mental shortcut or model that helps us make sense of something complex. For example, social class is a concept. It simplifies a wide range of economic and social factors into a category we can study and talk about. Concepts help us break down big, messy parts of the social world into something we can analyze more easily. So overall, positivist sociology aims to explain social behavior by looking for general patterns using tools that are objective, measurable, and grounded in observation. Continuing with positivist sociology, let's talk about some of the key tools used in this approach: variables, measurement, and operationalization. These are all part of how sociologists turn abstract ideas into something they can actually study and analyze. First, a variable is a concept whose value can change from one case to another. For example, take something like income, age, education level, or even something less obvious like job satisfaction. These are all variables because they don't stay the same across all people or situations. They vary. Once we have a variable in mind, the next step is measurement. That's the process of figuring out the value of a variable in a specific case. So if we're studying education levels in a group of people, measurement means actually recording how far each person went in school. Did they finish high school, get a college degree, and so on. Measurement helps turn a broad concept into specific usable data. Before we can measure anything, we need to be really clear about what exactly we're measuring. That's where we operationalize a variable. This means spelling out in detail what we're looking at and how we'll measure it. For instance, if we're studying social class, we need to decide, are we measuring it based on income, education, occupation, or a combination of these? Operationalizing makes sure we're all on the same page and collecting consistent, reliable data. These steps are all essential to doing scientific sociology. They help make sure that what we're observing is clear, measurable, and grounded in real-world evidence, so we can draw accurate conclusions about how society works. As we continue exploring how sociologists conduct research, it's important to understand two critical concepts: reliability and validity. These are the standards we use to evaluate how trustworthy our research tools and findings are. Let's start with reliability. This refers to consistency in measurement. So if you're using a survey or a test to measure something, like attitudes about social issues or income levels, you want that instrument to give consistent results each time it's used under the same conditions. If someone takes the same survey twice and gives completely different answers each time, that would be a sign that the survey might not be very reliable. In short, reliability asks, are we getting steady, repeatable results? Then we have validity, which is about precision. It asks whether we're actually measuring what we intend to measure. For example, if we say we're measuring someone's level of stress, but we're only asking them how many hours they work each week, we're probably missing the full picture. That measure might be reliable, it might give consistent answers, but it wouldn't be valid because it doesn't truly capture the concept of stress. Sociologists also use descriptive statistics, like the mean or average, to summarize data from large populations. These statistics help us make sense of patterns and trends, but their usefulness depends on how reliable and valid our measurements are. So when designing research tools, sociologists always aim for both reliability and validity, consistent results that truly reflect what we're trying to study. Without those, any conclusions we draw could be misleading or incomplete. Now let's talk about the difference between correlation and cause and effect, a really important distinction in sociological research. First, a correlation simply means that two or more variables change together. So, for example, if we find that as education levels increase, income tends to increase too. That's a correlation. The two variables are linked, they rise or fall together, but that doesn't automatically mean one causes the other. That's where the idea of a spurious correlation comes in. This is when two variables seem to be related, but the relationship is actually caused by some third factor. For example, let's say we notice that ice cream sales and drowning incidents both go up during the summer. Those two things are correlated, but it's not because ice cream causes drowning. The real cause is the third variable, hot weather, which increases both swimming and ice cream consumption. Now, cause and effect is a stronger, more specific relationship. This is when a change in one variable directly causes a change in another. To establish this kind of link, researchers need solid evidence, and usually a controlled environment to rule out other explanations. To understand this relationship, we talk about independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is the one that causes the change. It's what you, as the researcher, manipulate or examine as a potential influence. The dependent variable is the one that changes in response. Its value depends on the independent variable. So let's say we're studying whether class size affects student performance. Class size would be the independent variable, and student performance, may be measured by test scores, would be the dependent variable. If test scores go down as class size increases, and we can rule out other factors, we might be seeing a cause and effect relationship. Understanding the difference between correlation and causation is crucial in sociology. It helps us avoid jumping to conclusions and reminds us to look carefully at the data and the context before claiming one thing causes another. Next, let's talk about a core principle in sociological research, objectivity. Objectivity means personal neutrality, doing research in a way that minimizes bias and keeps personal beliefs or emotions from influencing the results. Now, it's totally normal and actually very common for sociologists to choose research topics that matter to them. These are called value-relevant topics. Maybe someone studies poverty, gender roles, or immigration because of personal experience or a deep interest in social justice. And that's okay. Passion can be a great motivator in research. But once the research begins, the goal is to be value-free. That means setting aside personal opinions or hopes about what the findings should show, and instead focusing on what the evidence actually tells us. Researchers are expected to report their results honestly and carefully, even if the outcomes challenge their expectations or beliefs. This idea of objectivity is about building trust in the research process. It's what helps sociology stay grounded in evidence and analysis rather than opinion. Of course, complete neutrality is difficult, if not impossible, but striving for objectivity ensures that the work is more balanced, credible, and useful for understanding the world as it really is. Now let's take a closer look at interpretive sociology, which takes a different approach from the more scientific, data-driven style we saw with positivist sociology. Interpretive sociology is all about understanding the meanings people attach to their social world. Instead of asking, what are the patterns, or how many people do this, interpretive sociology asks, why do people do this? And what does it mean to them? The focus here isn't on trying to explain behavior with broad laws or generalizations. Instead, it's about interpretation, getting inside people's everyday experiences and understanding how they see and make sense of the world around them. This approach doesn't reject science altogether, but it does shift the focus. Rather than aiming for objectivity and large-scale data, interpretive sociologists are more interested in the subjective side of social life, how people experience things, what symbols they use, and how their interactions create shared meaning. That's why interpretive sociology tends to favor qualitative data, like interviews, observations, or case studies over statistics and surveys. It's more about rich detail than broad trends. At the heart of this approach is the concept of Verstehen, a German word that means understanding. The idea is that to really understand human behavior, we need to look at things from the point of view of the people involved. What are their motivations? What do their actions mean in their own social context? So interpretive sociology gives us a powerful way to explore the human side of social life. It helps us understand how meaning is created and shared, and how that shapes the way society works from the ground up. Finally, we come to critical sociology, which takes yet another distinct approach. This perspective focuses directly on inequality and the urgent need for social change. Critical sociology developed as a reaction to what many saw as the limitations of positivist sociology. While positivism tries to be neutral and focus on describing how society works, critical sociology argues that we can't stop there. It says we need to challenge the status quo, especially when it involves injustice or exploitation. This approach rejects the idea that society is some kind of natural fixed system. Instead, it sees society as shaped by human decisions, power structures, and inequalities, particularly those related to class, race, gender, and other forms of difference. If those systems were created by people, then they can also be changed by people. One of the central ideas here is that the point of sociology isn't just to study the world, it's to change it. That means research shouldn't just sit in academic journals or classrooms. It should connect with real-world struggles and support efforts to create a fairer, more equal society. So, critical sociology takes an activist orientation. It ties knowledge to action. Sociologists working from this approach often collaborate with communities when participate in social movements or advocate for policy changes. Their research is driven by a commitment to justice and a belief that understanding the world is only the first step. Improving it is the real goal. This approach reminds us that sociology is not only about analysis, it can also be a tool for transformation. As we wrap up our look at sociological research, it's important to talk about how gender can affect the research process, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes not so subtle. One major issue is androcentricity. This means approaching a topic from a male-centered perspective, where men's experiences are seen as the norm. The opposite, gynocentricity, is the same idea but with a focus on women. The problem with either approach is that it can leave out important parts of the picture. When research is based only on one gender's point of view, it risks misunderstanding or ignoring the experiences of others. Another issue is overgeneralizing. This happens when researchers collect data from only one gender, often men, and then apply the results to everyone. For example, if a study about workplace behavior only includes male employees, but then makes claims about workers in general, that's overgeneralization. It assumes that what's true for men is automatically true for women, which is often not the case. We also have to watch out for gender blindness, which is the failure to consider gender at all in the research. This can lead to missing key insights or making flawed assumptions. For example, a study on income inequality that doesn't consider gender might overlook how the gender pay gap affects the results. Then there are double standards, where different expectations or judgments are applied to men and women in the same situation. This can show up in research when certain behaviors are interpreted differently depending on the subject's gender, which skews the findings and introduces bias. And finally, we have interference, which happens when the gender of the researcher affects the way participants respond. For example, someone being interviewed about personal topics might answer differently if they're speaking to a man versus a woman. This doesn't mean the data is useless, but it's something researchers need to be aware of and account for in their analysis. So, overall, being mindful of gender in research is about recognizing how it can shape the way questions are asked, how data is collected, and how results are interpreted. Addressing these issues helps make research more accurate, inclusive, and meaningful. As with any discipline that studies real people, ethics are a critical part of doing research in sociology. Sociologists have a responsibility not just to collect accurate data, but to do so in a way that respects the rights and dignity of everyone involved. First, researchers must strive to be technically competent and fair-minded. That means using appropriate methods, being honest about what the data shows, and keeping personal biases out of the process as much as possible. It's also essential to disclose findings fully. Researchers can't just report the results that support their argument and ignore the rest. All significant data should be included, and researchers should be willing to share their data with others, especially when their findings are being reviewed or challenged. Another major responsibility is to protect the safety, rights, and privacy of the people being studied. This includes making sure that participation is voluntary and that subjects are not harmed physically, emotionally, or socially as a result of being part of the research. A big part of that is obtaining informed consent. This means that participants are made fully aware of what the research involves, including any possible risks or responsibilities, and that they agree to take before the study begins. Consent must be clear, informed, and freely given. Researchers also need to disclose all sources of funding and avoid any conflicts of interest. If a study is funded by a group that has a stake in the outcome, that needs to be made transparent so people can judge the findings fairly. And finally, sociologists must demonstrate cultural sensitivity. That means being respectful and aware of cultural differences when conducting research, especially in diverse communities. The goal is to understand, not to judge or misrepresent, the people being studied. Ethical research is not just about following rules. It's about maintaining trust, integrity, and respect in every part of the research process. Now let's look at the tools sociologists use to actually carry out their research. These are called research methods, which simply means a systematic plan for collecting and analyzing data. There are several major methods in sociology, each suited to different kinds of questions and goals. First, we have the experiment. This method is used to investigate cause and effect under highly controlled conditions. Sociologists might use experiments to test how certain variables influence behavior. For example, they could study how group pressure affects decision-making. The strength of this method is that it allows researchers to isolate variables and see how one thing directly influences another. But because it's so controlled, it may not always reflect how people act in everyday life. Next is participant observation, also known as fieldwork. This method involves systematically observing people by joining in their routine activities. The researcher becomes part of the group they're studying, whether it's a classroom, a religious community, or a street market. This approach offers rich, in-depth insight into people's behavior and social interactions, especially in their natural settings. It's less about numbers and more about context and meaning. Then there's using existing sources, which means working with data that has already been collected by others, like government statistics, historical records, or previous research studies. This method is efficient and can reveal long-term patterns. But researchers need to be careful about how the original data was collected and whether it suits their own research questions. Each method has its strengths and limitations. So sociologists choose based on what they want to study, what kind of data they need, and how they can collect it ethically and effectively. Sometimes they even combine methods to get a fuller picture of the social world. Another very common method in sociology is survey research. This approach involves asking people to respond to a series of questions, either in writing or through a conversation. It's one of the best ways to gather data from large groups and find out what people think, feel, or do. A survey can be done using a questionnaire, which is a set of written questions or statements that people fill out on their own. Questionnaires are useful when you need to reach a lot of people and keep things standardized. They can be done on paper, online, or even through a mobile app. The other option is an interview, where the researcher personally asks each question. This method allows for more flexibility. People can ask for clarification, and the researcher can pick up on body language or tone. Interviews can give more detailed, in-depth responses, but they're also more time-consuming. When doing survey research, it's important to define your population. That's the entire group of people you want to learn about. For example, if you're studying student stress levels, your population might be all university students in Canada. Since it's not always practical to survey everyone in a population, researchers use a sample, a smaller group that represents the whole. A good sample reflects the diversity of the population so that the findings can be applied more broadly. Survey research is especially useful for gathering large amounts of data and identifying patterns across different groups, but it depends on well-designed questions and thoughtful sampling to make sure the results are accurate and meaningful. To wrap up our section on research, let's go through the steps sociologists follow when conducting a study. Like any careful investigation, doing sociological research involves a clear step-by-step process to make sure the work is thoughtful, ethical, and reliable. 1. Select and define a topic. This is where the researcher chooses something meaningful, socially relevant, and researchable. Once chosen, the topic must be clearly defined so the focus is specific and understandable. 2. Review the literature. This means looking at what other scholars have already written about the topic. Reviewing the literature helps avoid duplication, identifies knowledge gaps, and provides a strong foundation for the new study. 3. Develop key questions. These questions guide the research and determine what kind of data is needed. They focus the study and help ensure that it stays on track. 4. Assess requirements for the study. This includes practical factors like time, resources, access to participants, and tools needed for data collection. 5. Consider ethical issues. Researchers must protect participants' rights, ensuring informed consent, confidentiality, and that no harm comes to those involved. Ethics are central to all sociological work. 6. Select a research methodology. This means choosing how the data will be collected, whether through surveys, interviews, fieldwork, experiments, or existing sources. 7. Collect the data. Data collection must be systematic and well documented to ensure reliability and transparency. Every step should be clear enough for others to follow or replicate. 8. Interpret the findings. This is where researchers analyze the data, look for patterns, and figure out how the results answer the original research questions. 9. State the conclusions. Researchers summarize what the study found, why it matters, and how it adds to our understanding of the topic. 10. Publish the findings. Sharing the results through reports, journals, or presentations allows others to learn from, critique, and build on the research. By following these steps, sociological research remains rigorous, ethical, and useful, not only to academics, but to communities, policymakers, and anyone interested in understanding how society works.